The T-34 was a Soviet medium tank from World War II that changed the course of tank design and battlefield strategies. Introduced with a powerful 3-inch gun and 60-degree sloped armor, it offered significant protection against anti-tank weapons. The T-34 played a crucial role on the Eastern Front and left a lasting legacy in military history. During Operation Barbarossa, German generals recognized its strengths, although its armor and firepower were eventually surpassed later in the war. One of the T-34's main advantages was its low cost and quick production time, allowing Soviet forces to field large numbers against the German panzers. Throughout the war, the T-34 was the backbone of the Soviet Red Army's armored forces. Its design remained largely unchanged until 1944, when the improved T-34-85 variant was introduced, enhancing its firepower. Production methods were continuously refined, making the tank quicker and cheaper to produce, despite the heavy losses in combat. The Soviets built over 80,000 T-34s in various models, maintaining high numbers on the battlefield. The T-34 replaced many light and medium tanks in the Red Army and became the most produced tank of World War II. It also holds the record for the second most produced tank of all time, following its successor, the T-54/T-55 series. Despite losing 44,900 units during the war, the T-34's design led directly to the development of the T-44, T-54, and T-55 tanks, and eventually the T-62, which are still core elements of many modern armies. Even after World War II, T-34 variants were exported worldwide, and as recently as 2023, more than 80 were still in service. Origins. Back in 1939, the Soviet Union's tank fleet mainly consisted of T-26 infantry tanks and the speedy BT series tanks. The T-26 was designed to move slowly alongside infantry, while the BT tanks were built for fast, maneuverable warfare. Both models were adaptations of foreign designs, the T-26 from the British Vickers 6-ton and the BT tanks from American engineer J. Walter Christie. In 1937, engineer Mikhail Koshkin was tasked with designing a new tank to replace the BT series at the Kharkiv Komintern locomotive plant. The first prototype, named A-20, had a modified engine, 0.8-inch armor, a 1.77-inch gun, and used a less flammable diesel fuel. It could run on wheels without tracks, saving on maintenance but adding complexity without combat benefits. Improved track designs eventually made this feature obsolete. The A-20 also included sloped armor, which deflected enemy rounds better than vertical armor. During the 1938 Battle of Lake Khasan and the 1939 battles of Khalkhin Gol against Japan, Soviet tanks like the T-26 and BT faced challenges. Their petrol engines often caught fire when hit by Molotov cocktails, and poor quality welds allowed flaming fuel to penetrate. Riveted armor posed another risk, as impacts caused rivets to become deadly projectiles inside the tank. After these battles, Koshkin convinced Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to allow the development of a more robust tank prototype, the A-32, with 1.3-inch frontal armor and a 3-inch gun. Field trials in 1939 showed the heavier A-32 was as mobile as the A-20. An even heavier version with 1.77-inch front armor, wider tracks, and a new 3-inch gun was approved for production as the T-34. Koshkin named it to honor his early ideas from 1934 and the year's decree to expand the armored force. Lessons from Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol on armor, mobility, welding, and weaponry were integrated into the T-34, marking a significant upgrade over the BT and T-26. By January 1940, 2 T-34 prototypes were ready. They embarked on a rigorous 1,200-mile journey from Kharkiv to Moscow, Finland, and back, identifying and fixing drivetrain issues along the way. Initial production. Overcoming resistance from the military command and concerns about high production costs was a major hurdle. However, the poor performance of Soviet tanks in the Winter War in Finland and the impressive effectiveness of German tanks during the Battle of France pushed the decision forward. By September 1940, the first T-34 tanks rolled off the production line, replacing the T-26, BT series, and the multi-turreted T-28 medium tank at the KHPZ plant. Unfortunately, Mikhail Koshkin, the lead designer, passed away from pneumonia, worsened by his long drive from Kharkiv to Moscow, at the end of that month. Alexander Morozov, who had developed the T-34's drivetrain, was then appointed chief designer. The T-34 introduced new challenges for Soviet industry. It featured heavier armor than any previous medium tank, leading to issues with defective armor plates. Only the tanks of company commanders were equipped with radios due to their high cost and limited availability. The rest of the crews had to rely on flag signals. The original L-11 gun proved inadequate, prompting the Graben Design Bureau at Gorky Factory No. 92 to develop the superior 3-inch F-34 gun. Despite initial bureaucratic resistance, Gorky and KHPZ started producing the new gun, and official approval came only after soldiers praised its combat performance against the Germans. The first T-34 series, the Model 1940, saw a limited production run of about 400 units before the transition to the Model 1941. This newer model featured the F-34 gun, a 9RS radio set, also used in the Su-100, and even thicker armor. Mass production. The T-34 tank's mass production involved several factories. The Kharkiv Diesel Factory No. 75 supplied the V-234 engine, while the Leningrad Kirovsky factory produced the original L-11 gun, and the Dynamo factory in Moscow made the electrical components. Initial assembly took place at Plant No. 183, with production expanding in early 1941 to the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, STZ, and, starting in July, the Krasnoye Sormovo Factory No. 112 in Gorky. Germany's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, forced the Soviet Union to evacuate and relocate its tank factories eastward to the Ural Mountains. This enormous and rushed operation was a logistical nightmare and extremely taxing for the workers involved. Alexander Morozov oversaw the evacuation of skilled workers, machinery, and stock from KHPZ to the Dzerzhinsky Ural Railcar Factory in Nizhny Tagil, renamed Stalin Ural Tank Factory No. 183. The Kirovsky factory moved to the Stalin Tractor Factory in Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tank City. Workers and equipment from Leningrad's Voroshilov Tank Factory were integrated into the Ural and New Omsk factories. The Ordzhonikidze Ural Heavy Machine Tool Works in Sverdlovsk absorbed workers and machines from smaller shops in the path of advancing German forces. While these factories were being moved, the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory in Stalingrad worked double shifts from September 1941 to September 1942 to compensate for lost production, making up 40% of all T-34s produced during this time. Even as the Battle of Stalingrad surrounded the factory, production continued under desperate conditions, with reports of unpainted T-34s driving straight from the factory to the battlefield. Production at Stalingrad continued until September 1942. Soviet designers knew about the T-34's design flaws but avoided making changes that would slow production. They focused on simplifying and speeding up manufacturing. New methods for automated welding and hardening armor plates, including innovations by Professor Yevgeny Patin, were developed. The design of the F-34 gun was streamlined from 861 parts to 614. The narrow, cramped turrets were replaced with a more spacious hexagonal design starting in 1942, which was also quicker to produce. Limited rubber supplies led to the use of all-steel road wheels, and an improved 5-speed transmission and engine clutch increased reliability. Over 2 years, the unit production cost dropped from 269,500 rubles in 1941 to 135,000 rubles. By 1943, T-34 production reached about 1,300 tanks per month, equivalent to 3 full-strength tank divisions. By the end of 1945, over 57,300 T-34s had been built, including 34,780 T-34 tanks with 3-inch guns and 22,609 of the upgraded T-34-85 model. The largest producer was Factory No. 183, which built 28,952 T-34s and T-34-85s from 1941 to 1945. The second largest was Krasnoye Sormovo Factory No. 112 in Gorky, with 12,604 tanks. At the start of the German-Soviet War, T-34s made up about 4% of the Soviet tank arsenal, but by the end, they accounted for at least 55% of tank production. After the war, an additional 2,701 T-34s were built before Soviet production ended. Licensed production was restarted in Poland, 1951 to 1955. And Czechoslovakia, 1951 to 1958, producing 1,380 and 3,185 T-34-85s, respectively, by 1956. In total, around 84,070 T-34s were built, plus 13,170 self-propelled guns on T-34 chassis. It was the most produced tank of World War II and the second most produced tank ever, after its successor, the T-54-55 series. Design. The T-34 was known for its well-sloped armor, powerful engine, and wide tracks. The initial version of the T-34, often referred to as the T-34-76 due to its 3-inch gun, provided substantial firepower. In 1944, a major upgrade led to the T-34-85, featuring a larger 85mm gun designed to counter the newer German tanks. When comparing the T-34 to the US M4 Sherman tank, several similarities emerge. Both tanks were the backbone of their respective armies' armored units and were widely distributed to allies, who also relied on them as primary fighting vehicles. Both the T-34 and the Sherman were extensively upgraded with more powerful guns over time. They were designed with a focus on mobility, ease of manufacture, and maintenance, which sometimes meant sacrificing some performance. Their chassis served as the base for various support vehicles, including armor recovery vehicles, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery. The T-34, M4 Sherman, and the German Panzer IV were roughly equivalent in many respects, each having its own strengths and weaknesses. However, neither the T-34 nor the M4 Sherman could match the firepower and armor of Germany's heavier tanks like the Panther or Tiger I. For these tougher opponents, the Soviets deployed the IS-2 heavy tank, while the US used the M26 Pershing. Armor. The T-34's sloped armor design provided superior protection compared to its actual thickness. This shape not only enhanced its defensive capabilities but also reduced the weight needed to achieve the same level of protection. Some tanks had additional armor welded onto the hull and turret, known as Ergonomics or with screens in Russian. In late 1942, the USSR sent two combat-used Model 1941 T-34s to the United States for testing. The tests at the Aberdeen Proving Ground revealed issues with the armor's build quality, particularly with the joins and welds. They also found that soft steel and shallow tempering were used. During heavy rain, water leaked through cracks, disabling electrical equipment and even ammunition. Early T-34 models had cast turrets with softer armor, which couldn't withstand even 37mm anti-aircraft shells. Poor quality welds often led to penetrations that would normally not occur, and rushed manufacturing resulted in inconsistent protection. Further examination at Aberdeen showed the use of various alloys in different parts of the T-34's armor. Thinner rolled sections used MNC-MO steels, thicker sections used CR-MO steels, and both rolled and cast components from 2 to 5 inches thick used MNC-Ni CR-MO steels. Some moderately thick cast sections employed Ni CR-MO steels. Although heat treated to prevent armor-piercing shells from penetrating, this made the armor brittle and prone to spalling when hit by high explosive shells. Despite these flaws, the T-34's armor was a challenge for the Germans early in the Eastern Front campaign. One T-34 reportedly took 23 hits from a 37mm gun and only had its turret ring jammed. A German report from May 1942 noted that their 50mm guns were only effective against the T-34 from short ranges and specific angles. A report from the 10th Tank Division in August 1941 indicated that the 37mm PaK-36 could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor within 300 to 400 meters. An analysis in January 1943 showed that 54.3% of T-34 losses were due to the German 5cm KWK-39 gun. As the war progressed, the T-34's initial advantages diminished. The Germans deployed more effective anti-tank weapons like the 7.5cm PaK-40, 88mm armed Tigers, anti-aircraft guns, and 8.8cm PaK-43 anti-tank guns. The Panzer IVs were upgraded with the 7.5cm KWK-40 gun, capable of penetrating the T-34-76's frontal turret at 1,200 meters from any angle. A report indicated that a Panther could penetrate the T-34-85's turret at up to 2,000 meters, and the Glassy from 800 meters. Similarly, the Tiger I's 8.8cm gun could penetrate the T-34's frontal turret at 1,400 meters. Ground trials in May 1943 showed that the 88mm gun could pierce the T-34's frontal hull from 1,500 meters, causing severe internal damage due to poor armor quality. Recommendations were made to improve welds and armor quality. During the Korean War, analysis showed that the 76 and 90mm rounds of the M41 Walker Bulldog and M46 Patton could penetrate the T-34 from 800 yards. However, data on maximum range penetration was lacking. In late 1950, a captured T-34-85 was evaluated by the UN in the Korean War, concluding that the sloped armor was effective in deflecting shells. The armor quality was comparable to US armor, though casting defects and gaps in the joints were problematic, posing a risk of injury from bullet splash and shell fragments. Firepower. The T-34 was initially equipped with the 76.2mm F-34 gun, which was effective against early German tanks. This gun could penetrate 92mm of armor at 500 yards and 60mm at 1,000 yards with APCR shells. The best German tanks in 1941, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, had frontal armor of only 50 to 60mm. However, by 1942, the Panzer IV's hull armor increased to 80 mm, providing better protection. The F-34 gun also fired an effective high-explosive round. Despite its firepower, the T-34's gun sights and range-finding tools, either the TMFD-7 or PT-47, were quite basic compared to German optics. This impacted accuracy and long-range engagement. German reports noted that T-34s often operated in a disorganized manner, with tank commanders struggling with poor vision devices and dual responsibilities of gunnery and command. This led to less effective use of firepower, as T-34 platoons would often focus on a single target rather than engaging multiple threats. As the war progressed, German tanks like the Tiger I and Panther emerged, which were resistant to the T-34's 76 mm gun when hit from the front. These tanks could only be penetrated from the sides at close range. This prompted the upgrade to the T-34-85 model, featuring an 85 mm ZIS gun. This new gun significantly increased the tank's firepower. It could penetrate the front turret of a Tiger I from 550 yards and the driver's plate from 330 yards at a 30-degree angle. The new turret design allowed for a 3-man crew, separating the commander and gunner roles, enhancing overall effectiveness. The D5T gun on the T-34-85 could penetrate the upper hull armor of a Tiger I at 1,000 yards. However, the T-34-85 struggled to penetrate the Panther's frontal turret armor at 550 yards unless tungsten rounds were used or shots were aimed at the weaker side armor. The longer 85 mm gun barrel required careful handling to avoid damage. Tank commander A.K. Rodkin noted that the barrel could dig into the ground, potentially ruining it if fired. Standard practice when moving cross-country was to elevate the gun fully or reverse the turret. During the Korean War, the U.S. captured a T-34-85 and found that its gun could penetrate 4.1 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, similar to the performance of the M41's FAP rounds. The maximum effective range was 2 to 3 kilometers, but the practical range was up to 1,900 yards. Mobility. The T-34 was driven by a Model V234, a 38.8 liters V12 diesel engine with 500 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 33 miles per hour. It featured the coil spring Christie suspension from earlier BT series tanks, which used a slack track system with a rear-mounted drive sprocket and no return rollers for the upper track run. The T-34 did away with the heavy and inefficient convertible drive found in previous models. T-34s equipped with a 4-speed gearbox could only use 4th gear on roads, being limited to 3rd gear off-road. The first batch of these tanks required considerable effort to shift from 2nd to 3rd gear, needing between 101 to 247 pounds of force. However, in September 1941, changes were made to reduce this effort to less than 68 pounds by adjusting the 3rd gear ratio, which decreased the top speed in 3rd gear from 18 miles per hour to 15 miles per hour but made shifting easier. The introduction of a 5-speed gearbox allowed the T-34 to use 4th gear off-road, enabling it to reach 18 miles per hour on rough terrain. The T-34-76 had a ground pressure of about 10.2 pounds per square inch, and its wide tracks provided excellent performance on dirt roads and off-road compared to other tanks of the time. Despite this, T-34s could still get stuck in mud. For instance, on February 4, 1944, the 21st Guards Tank Brigade was ordered to travel to Tolstoy Rogi, about 50 miles away. Out of the 32 tanks, 19 either got stuck in the mud or experienced mechanical failures. Ergonomics. The original 76 mm armed T-34 had significant ergonomic issues, especially when compared to the later 85 mm variant. The 2-man turret crew, with the commander also serving as the gunner, was cramped and inefficient. This was a common setup for Soviet tanks at the time but was inferior to the 3-man turret crews, commander, gunner, and loader, of the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. German reports noted that T-34s were slow to find and engage targets, whereas Panzers could typically fire 3 rounds for every 1 shot by a T-34. Early in the war, the T-34 commander faced additional disadvantages. The forward opening hatch and lack of a turret cupola forced him to observe the battlefield through a single vision slit and a traversable periscope. Unlike German commanders who fought heads up with a full field of view, T-34 commanders couldn't do this. Soviet veterans criticized the early model turret hatches, nicknamed Parashok, stuffed bun, for their shape, as they were heavy and difficult to open. These complaints led to a design change in August 1942, adding 2 hatches to the turret. The loader's job was also challenging due to the absence of a turret basket, a rotating floor that moves with the turret, a problem that German tanks shared before the Panzer IV. The T-34's turret floor was made up of ammunition stored in small metal boxes covered by a rubber mat. 9 ready rounds were stowed in racks on the sides of the fighting compartment. Once these were used, the crew had to retrieve additional ammunition from the floor boxes, cluttering the floor with open bins and matting, which hindered performance. The tight space of the two-man turret in the T-34 Model 1941 posed additional challenges. American evaluators couldn't understand how Soviet tankers could fit inside during winter while wearing bulky sheepskin jackets. The turret's electrical rotation mechanism was weak, overloaded, and prone to sparking, causing the speed regulator to burn out and cogwheels to break. They recommended replacing it with a hydraulic or manual system. The lack of a turret basket also posed a risk, as crew members could get caught in the drive mechanism, potentially injuring them and taking them out of combat. Most of these ergonomic issues were addressed with the introduction of the T-34-85 in 1944, which featured a larger cast 3-man turret. General reliability. The T-34's wide tracks and robust suspension system provided excellent cross-country performance, yet early in its service, these advantages were hindered by numerous initial design flaws. Long journeys could be perilous. For example, in June 1941, the 8th Mechanized Corps under Dmitry Ryabyshev lost half of its vehicles during a 500 km march towards Dubno. A.V. Bodnar, who served in combat during 1941-42, noted, "From an operational standpoint, German armored vehicles were nearly perfect, breaking down less often. Germans could cover 200 kilometers effortlessly, while T-34s would inevitably suffer some breakdowns. Their technology was superior, though their combat gear was not as effective." The T-34 initially had a gearbox with 4 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, which was replaced by a 5-speed gearbox in the final 1943 models. Early T-34 tracks were the most frequently repaired component. A.V. Maryevsky recalled, "The tracks often broke apart even without taking hits. When mud got stuck between the road wheels, the tracks, especially during turns, strained so much that the pins and tracks couldn't hold out." In late 1942, the USSR donated 2 combat-used Model 1941 T-34s to the United States for testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The tests revealed many early faults, which were also acknowledged in a 1942 Soviet report. The report stated, "Christie's suspension was long rejected by the Americans. On our tanks, poor steel in the springs quickly fatigues, reducing clearance. Our tracks are light and easily damaged by small caliber rounds. The pins are poorly tempered and made of poor steel, wearing quickly and causing frequent breaks." The Aberdeen tests also highlighted that engines could fail due to dust and sand ingestion, as the original Palman air filter was ineffective, starving the engine of oxygen and reducing compression. By the time of the Aberdeen tests, this issue had been addressed with cyclone filters on the Model 1943 and more efficient multi-cyclone filters on the T-34-85. Other problems identified included poor reliability of the turret drive and the use of poorly machined, low-quality steel side friction clutches. The outdated and poorly manufactured transmission led to frequent mechanical failures, creating harsh conditions for the driver. Radios, if present, had a limited range of under 16 kilometers. The report from Aberdeen noted, "Russians, when producing tanks, pay little attention to careful machining or finishing of small parts, leading to a loss of advantages in otherwise well-designed tanks. Despite diesel use, good contours, thick armor, and reliable armaments, Russian tanks are significantly inferior to American tanks in ease of driving, maneuverability, firing strength, speed, mechanical reliability, and maintenance simplicity." Soviet tests on newly built T-34s showed that in April 1943, only 10.1% could complete a 330 km trial, dropping to 7.7% in June. This figure remained below 50% until October 1943, when it rose to 78%, then dropped to 57% in November, averaging 82% in December 1943, January 1944. During February 1944 tests, 79% of tanks reached 300 kilometers, and 33% of test batches reached 1,000 kilometers. Tank troops noticed this improvement. P. G. Diner, deputy commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, commented that in 1943, tanks reached only 75% of their guaranteed lifespan, but in 1944, they reached 150%. Operation Barbarossa, 1941. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. At the onset, the Red Army had 967 T-34 tanks and 508 kV tanks concentrated in 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. The presence of these tanks was a psychological shock to German soldiers, who had anticipated facing a weaker enemy. The T-34, superior to any tank in the German arsenal at the time, was a particular surprise. Alfred Jodel's diary reflects this astonishment, noting the unexpected appearance of these formidable tanks in Riga. Both Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist and Heinz Guderian recognized the T-34's superiority, with von Kleist calling it the finest tank in the world and Guderian acknowledging its vast advantages over German tanks. Initially, the German forces struggled to destroy T-34s in combat, as their standard anti-tank weapons were ineffective against its heavy, sloped armor. In one early encounter, a T-34 crushed a 3.7 cm Pak-36, destroyed 2 Panzer IIs, and left a trail of destruction before being taken out by a howitzer at close range. Another incident saw a T-34 withstand over 30 hits from German anti-tank guns, only to return to its lines intact a few hours later. This led to the 37 mm Pak-36 being nicknamed the tank door knocker because it could not penetrate the T-34's armor. German gunners resorted to targeting the tank's tracks or aiming at vulnerable areas like the turret ring and gun mantlet. To effectively combat the T-34, the Germans had to use 105 mm field guns and 88 mm anti-aircraft guns in direct fire roles. Despite the initial advantages of the T-34, Soviet units equipped with these tanks lost most of them within weeks. In 1941, the Soviets lost an average of over 7 tanks for every German tank destroyed. Overall, they lost 20,500 tanks in 1941, including approximately 2,300 T-34s and over 900 heavy tanks, primarily KVs. This high rate of loss was due not only to the disparity in tactical and operational skills but also to mechanical defects in Soviet tanks. The new T-34s and KVs experienced significant issues, particularly with clutches and transmissions. Mechanical breakdowns accounted for at least 50% of the tank losses during the summer, and there was a lack of recovery and repair equipment. Early T-34 crews often carried a spare transmission on the engine deck due to the frequent mechanical failures. Other factors that reduced the initial impact of T-34s included poor leadership, inadequate tank tactics, the initial lack of radios in tanks, and insufficient crew training. These issues were partly the result of Stalin's purge of the Soviet officer corps in 1937, which had severely impacted the army's efficiency and morale. As the campaign progressed, the loss of experienced personnel further exacerbated these problems. Typically, crews had only basic military training and 72 hours of classroom instruction. Historian Stephen Zaloga noted that the weaknesses of the mechanized corps were not due to the design of their equipment but rather to the poor mechanical state of the tanks, inadequate crew training, and the low quality of Soviet military leadership during the early stages of the war. Further action, 1942 to 1943. As the invasion progressed, German infantry received more 7.5 cm Pak-40 anti-tank guns, which could penetrate the T-34's armor from long distances. They also deployed larger numbers of 88 mm flak guns, effective against T-34s at very long ranges, although their size and unwieldiness often made them difficult to position in the rough Soviet terrain. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to upgrade the T-34. The Model 1942 had increased turret armor and simplified components. The Model 1943, introduced in the same year, featured even more armor, increased fuel capacity, and additional ammunition storage. It also had an improved engine air filter, a new clutch, and a more reliable 5-speed transmission. The Model 1943 also sported a new, slightly roomier hexagonal turret derived from the abandoned T-34M project, making it easier to manufacture. The T-34 played a crucial role in resisting the German summer offensive in 1942 and in the double encirclement maneuver that trapped the German 6th Army at Stalingrad in December 1942. This encirclement led to the 6th Army's surrender in February 1943, a pivotal moment widely considered the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. In 1943, the Soviets formed Polish and Czechoslovak armies in exile, which began receiving the T-34 Model 1943 with hexagonal turrets. Like Soviet tank crews, these new crews were quickly sent into action with minimal training, resulting in high casualties. In July 1943, the Germans launched Operation Citadel near Kursk, their last major offensive on the Eastern Front. This operation marked the debut of the German Panther tank, although the bulk of the fighting was carried by the Panzer III, Stug III, and Panzer IV. The campaign included the largest tank battles in history, peaking with the massive engagement at Prohorovka on July 12, though most tank losses on both sides were due to artillery and mines. The Soviet strategy to focus on one cost-effective design, minimizing costs and simplifying production while allowing only minor improvements, had been successful for the first 2 years of the war. However, the summer battles of 1943 revealed that the T-34's 76.2mm gun was no longer as effective. Soviet tank crews struggled against the improved frontal armor of the Panzer III and Panzer IV and couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of the new German Panther or Tiger I tanks at standard combat ranges without tungsten rounds. They had to rely on tactical skills, such as flanking maneuvers and combined arms, to compensate. Current active service. As of 2018, 9 countries still had T-34 tanks in their national armed forces inventories: Cuba, Yemen, the Republic of the Congo, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam. Among these operators, Vietnam had the largest known surviving fleet of T-34 series tanks, with 45. Yemen and Guinea each had 30, Guinea-Bissau had 10, Mali had 21, and Laos had 30. It was unclear how many T-34s remained in service in Cuba and North Korea. The tanks in the Republic of the Congo, Namibia, and Mali were believed to be in reserve storage or inoperable. In early 2019, the Laotian army retired its T-34s and sold them to Russia for public displays and museum exhibits. Successors. In 1944, the Soviet Union resumed pre-war development of a more advanced version of the T-34, leading to the creation of the T-44. This new tank featured a turret design based on the T-34-85 but introduced a new hull with torsion bar suspension and a transversely mounted engine. The T-44 had a lower profile than the T-34-85 and was simpler to manufacture. Between 150 and 200 of these tanks were built before the end of World War II. With substantial drivetrain changes, a new turret, and a 100mm gun, the T-44 evolved into the T-54, which began production in 1947. Thank you for watching our exploration of the legendary T-34 tank. We hope you enjoyed learning about its design, production, and battlefield impact during World War II. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating military history. Don't forget to leave your comments and let us know what topics you'd like to see next. Until then, keep discovering history with us.